last week we had a guest, so I didn't talk very much. We had a session about 3C PDF, of which I think the recording is already on the YouTube channel if you missed that. And that session talked about an online API for pdfToolbox and an app that was built around that. Very interesting stuff. We're going to talk about something that is similar and not similar today. And that is for once, about something that we have built ourselves. And you can see it there on screen. It is an API around pdfToolbox. So let's get started with that. This is what we're going to talk about. For those of you, it's a horrible pink slide, but anyway, for those of you who do not know who I am, but looking at the names of the people in here, I think I can keep this relatively short. For those of you who don't know who I am, my name is David. I'm the CTO at Four Pees, which means I get involved in most of the technical stuff and lots of other stuff as well. My background is with Enfocus. If I go a very long time back into the past. I was co-founder of Gradual, who created Switch, which is now also an Enfocus product. And I've been with Four Pees for the last 10 years. So that's as much for the introduction side. So why did we start with an API around pdfToolbox? Why did we want to make that? Well, the basic reasons you can see here, and this is something that came out of the projects that we did together with partners, the projects that we did ourselves, and the experience of helping customers to install and use pdfToolbox command line, usually on a web portal, web server, whatever it is that they want to integrate with. So what we see is that in general, if you have a developer or you have an IT person or someone who's used to building websites on the other side, explaining pdfToolbox CLI is not the big challenge. The CLI is very straightforward. There is a lot of documentation around it. There are movies around it. That usually goes pretty smoothly. In about 15 to 20 minutes, you can tell a developer how this works and how they should talk to it. There are, however, two parts of the process that started to be annoying for us in a number of these projects. And the first one is that pdfToolbox CLI ideally has to be on the same machine as as where you want to integrate it. Let's put it that way. So if you're building a web portal and you want to use pdfToolbox to do preflights or to fix files on the fly, then pdfToolbox CLI has to be installed on the same machine. And there are some workarounds, and we've used them. We've also advised them to customers to use them. One is, and I'm not even sure that that is still a thing and would still work today, but there used to be on Windows something to do remote CLI calls. And we have at one point worked with someone who was using that. It was not very straightforward. And the other workaround that is a little bit easier is using dispatcher and satellites, where you can talk locally to the dispatcher and then send the dispatcher can send the actual processing off to another machine running a satellite. However, even with that workaround, you still need to install something on that, that machine where the portal is, in this case, the dispatcher. The processing will not be done there, but you still need to install something there. So it's not an ideal solution. And actually, the workaround that you see in the second problem, to which I will come in a second, is also usable here. You could also set this up with hot folders if the machines are in the same type of network and so on. That can work as well, and we've also done that. But for integration, hot folders are not always ideal. So that is one problem that we've run into a couple of times. And the second problem, and usually a little bit more annoying even, is that it doesn't support queuing. Of course, if you run pdfToolbox server, if you use hot folders, then you do have queuing. You can drop 1,000 files in an input folder, and pdfToolbox will pick them up one by one, as well, depending on how many parallel processes you have configured. So there, that is supported. But if you want to use the CLI and you want to do an integration, then queuing is not supported in that same fashion. You can, of course, do parallel processing, and you could say, well, I want to do 4 things in parallel, or I want to do 8 things in parallel, and that is what the license allows. But if you then start if you have the 9th file, you're just going to get an error from pdfToolbox, and you won't be able to process it immediately. So you have to queue it somehow. That is not impossible, but for someone who has a little bit of an idea of integrating with a command line tool on a website, but is not an experienced developer or is not used to do these things, implementing a good task system or task queue or queuing system is definitely more difficult than just talking to the CLI itself. So again, it's something that we've run into a couple of times. Okay, so what is the solution to that? Well, what we wanted to do was create something that would overcome these 2 limitations and make it easier when it was necessary to integrate with pdfToolbox CLI. So what are we talking about? This is essentially what we're talking about. It's very simple, but what we're talking about is simple in essence as well. On the one hand, you have pdfToolbox CLI, which is installed somewhere on a machine. And then next to that, there is a Node.js application that we've developed that you install on the same machine. It doesn't have to be right next to pdfToolbox. There you can configure where it's going to look for the application, obviously. But you have to install a Node.js application in there, and that Node.js application provides a REST API that you can talk to from a client application. It's a very simple picture, but it does solve the 2 problems that, or the 2 limitations that I just talked about. The downside is, if you've paid attention, you still have to install something on the machine. And I said that that potentially was one of the problems. But luckily, what you need to install is only a small Node.js application, which is in some ways more acceptable than a heavy binary like pdfToolbox sometimes. So you still have to install something, but with a REST API, you can actually have the portal run somewhere else, or whatever is using pdfToolbox. You can have that run somewhere else, and you do REST calls. And the only thing that is required is that you can talk to this machine that is running pdfToolbox with the Node.js application on top of it. And of course, the Node.js application implements a queuing system so that you can send as many requests as you want, and they will be nicely queued until pdfToolbox has time to process them. There are quite a few limitations to what we have built, and as always, I think it's as important to know what the limitations are as it is to know what it can do. What we built it for was exactly what I said before, to fix these 2 limitations that we saw while using the CLI. The limitations that we have with this Node.js application is that it still needs to be installed locally somewhere, as I said before. So it's Node.js So it's not really a big issue in most cases, but it is still something that you need to install. It also needs to be on the same machine as pdfToolbox CLI, and it is really geared towards driving one pdfToolbox CLI instance. Yeah. That means specifically it cannot drive a cluster of pdfToolbox licenses. It cannot do auto-scaling. All of these things in what we have today are not supported. And I'm being very open to what we have today. Obviously, I think you know us well enough by now to understand that we also think about the future, and some of these things would be interesting for us to add in the future. But at the moment, this was created to manage a single pdfToolbox CLI instance. So what does this offer? Well, we've kind of split up. It's a REST API that it offers, obviously. So everything that you that we'll talk about here is a part of a REST API, and we've kind of split that up into 3 different sections of that API, from very basic, if you want, to more advanced. The first layer is a very small admin layer that allows you to get some administrative information. For example, you can get the version of pdfToolbox, but mostly you can get administrative information about the tasks you have outstanding. So each time you send a job to this Node.js application, it will queue that job. So there is an admin layer call that will allow you to get the number of waiting jobs in that queue. Likewise, I will be able to get information about what the status is of a particular task. Yeah, so I can do polling to see where these tasks are. Have they been started yet? If so, how much progress have been made, or if they have been finished, where are the results? The basic layer is the second thing, and what we've done there is actually a very simple way of implementing things. What we said was, yes, we can allow people to run a preflight profile or a process plan, but ideally, it should be easy to do exactly the same thing as what people are already used to with pdfToolbox CLI. So actually, there are REST calls that mirror each of the pdfToolbox CLI commands as well. Yeah? So there is a basic / profile call that allows you to run a specific preflight profile or process plan. But just as well, there is a basic / save as image or basic / split PDF. So everything that you can do, not 100% everything, but the things we felt made sense, everything that you can do with the actions in pdfToolbox that you can call directly on the command line, you can also do with the REST API. And the parameters that you pass are as much as possible identical to what you have on the command line. The reason we've done this is because it's very basic, so very simple to decide what to do and to implement. But it also makes it very easy for someone who's used the CLI and who wants to use something else instead to do that transition. It's exactly the same functionality. On top of that, there is something that we know we want, but we don't really have to a large extent today, and it's a more advanced layer. The idea of the advanced layer is to provide more specialized functionality, meaning have REST calls that get things done without having the need to create your own process plan and supply your own process plan. A good example of that could be, I want to do preflight according to the to a Gantt workgroup profile or a pdfX profile or some other ISO standard profile. It would make sense to have a call that does just that without you each time having to supply that particular profile. Yeah. And we have used that internally in projects to embed functionality for a particular client, but this is not something where we have a lot of work done in general already. Queuing. As I said, the Node.js application does queuing internally. We're using a library internally to do that so that A, we didn't have to do it or write that ourselves, and B, it is more stable than we could ever write it. So everything that you send to this REST API, except for the very basic admin stuff, is queued. You can internally, in a configuration file for this Node.js app, you can specify how many parallel processes you want to use. Of course, limited by the license that you have and limited by the hardware that you are running this on. That's the same as what you, for example, have in pdfToolbox server. And then after it has been queued, if there is room available on the with pdfToolbox, then it will be sent to pdfToolbox for processing. You can check the request status, but you can also pass, I call it a webhook. You can pass a webhook when you make a request and ask that the Node.js app will call you back if a particular task is done. So that is supported as well. How does it work? That should be relatively straightforward if you know how REST APIs work. We have created 3 different main endpoints: pdfToolbox admin, basic, and then advanced, and then each of the different things that you can do have their own verb or action, whatever you want to call it under that. So pdfToolbox admin queue size, for example, would return the size of the queue, the number of jobs that are at the moment waiting to be processed in your Node.js application. The same on the basic level. There is, like I said, something for profile and pose, slice, and all of the different actions that you have on the CLI normally as well. To get feedback, we've implemented something that the advantage is that meanwhile we've done quite a few integrations with all kinds of print systems out there, and everyone has a different way of tackling the same problem. We actually implement 2 different systems at the same time, so you can choose what you want to use. And what I mean with that is then every time that you send a job to be processed by the API, you automatically get a task ID that is returned. That's a unique ID for the task that you just started. But you can also pass in your own request ID. And that is because very often you already have in a portal or something else, you already have a unique ID. For example, unique ID that corresponds to that particular job that you're dealing with or that order that you're dealing with. Yeah, so you can pass in your own unique ID, and that is then also stored in the Node.js app, and you will be able to use that to request feedback as well. And when you make a request, as I said, you can also pass a URL, and that's completely optional. You don't have to do it. But you can. And then in order to get feedback, you choose either or both of the methods below. You can do polling, which means that from time to time you call pdfToolbox /admin/update for task. or update for requests. Update for task, you would pass the unique ID that you got back from the API for the task that you started. Update for request, you could do with your own internal unique ID, such as the order ID. If you're passing an update URL, you can still do polling if you want. That's not a problem. But as soon as the task is finished, that URL will then be called automatically as well. So if you wanted to do an integration with a focus switch, for example, in some way, you could pass the or have the rest of the action done in switch. Then you could pass an update URL that points to a switch installation and implement a flow in switch with a webhook to pick up the result. And then, where do the profiles and process plans and so on come from? Well, we've also taken a double approach there. I remember that we created this to make life in projects easier. And that means that sometimes, and in many cases, probably, you know what the resources are that you're going to need. You're going to implement this in some kind of portal with certain types of jobs. So you know which preflight profiles are going to be used by the client or by that portal. If there is imposition to be done or anything else to be done, you know ahead of time what these things are going to be. So we allow resources to be on the server running the API. So you have a Node.js application. The resources can be specified in a local format. And in that case, they will search for the resource in a local folder that is on that machine. The advantage, of course, is that in that case, you don't always have to send resources back and forth if you make requests. They can also be provided using a URL, and then they're downloaded and used as necessary. And then input and output is pretty straightforward. You can specify one or multiple input files. Why? Again, that is the same thing that the pdfToolbox CLI app itself supports. And we really modeled this to what the possibilities are there. So you could specify 5 URLs of PDF files. This API app is going to download them and is then going to process them once they have been downloaded. You can pass in variables if you want, just as you would on the CLI. Again, the language is going to, or the syntax is going to be a little bit different, and I'll very briefly show you what that looks like in a second. But you can pass as many variables as you want. You can also, and on the output side, you then get whatever output you've asked for. So on the input side, you can specify what reports you want, what types of reports. If it's template-based reports, you can specify a template. Again, all the things that normally you would be able to do with the CLI. And then the output is delivered as a URL that you can download. And that URL, well, you can either get URLs for individual result files. If you have a process plant that generates multiple things, for example, then you can download all of them from the using that URL, or optionally you can ask for all the results to be archived, and then you get the URL to the zip file, which in some cases makes it easier for people to do an integration, but it's optional and you don't have to use it. Okay, so I don't have much demo that I can do here because it's very technical, and I decided not to build a working prototype to show, but I can show you, or I do want to show you at least what the API looks like a little bit, which is the most important part. And then, for example, I can show you what the profile call, which is the most basic call would look like, and then you get something like this. Of course, this is a REST API, so you're going to deal not with a command line, but with JSON, but you can see that a lot of the stuff that you specify here is identical to what you would do on a command line. For example, I can set the language that I want, which corresponds to the same command line option that I would have for the CLI. I can specify reports. For reports, I can specify all of the different options that normally would be supported. We really modeled it after that. In this particular call, you can also see a request ID. What the value here is not important as long as it's unique and you know what that means. If you do the call, then you'll get a task ID, which is also unique that you can use. But if you already have a unique ID, then you can pass it in, and in all further communication, you can use your own unique ID. That is going to work just fine. There is an update URL. This one, of course, doesn't make sense and is just for showing what is supported. But this is a webhook URL that is going to be called automatically once that the processing is done. You can see that there is something called local here for the profile. That means that we're referring to a profile that is stored locally next in the app or next to the app if you want. But this could also be a URL to something that lives in S3 from Amazon or any other place where you have this URL. The only requirement is that it can be downloaded. If it's not local, of course, the API has to be able to download it in order to do processing. Same with the input files. You specify any file you want as long as it can be downloaded. And what you can see here is that there is a list of variables that is passed in. Same as with the CLI, you have a, you can pass as many variables as you want, and the only thing you have to specify is on the one hand, the name of the variable, and then on the other hand, the value that you want to set. Because this is JSON, this works exactly the same way. You can specify this as numbers, but in the end, when you pass it to pdfToolbox, as always, they're all passed as string in the end anyway. So that is essentially the full app, if you want. It is not much more complex than that. You install it. There is security in there that you have to make sure is correct, because obviously you don't want anyone on the internet to be able to connect with this thing. But you can connect, you can secure the communication between the Node.js app and the portal or whatever else it is that is talking to it. And then you get a list of different calls that you can make. And for each of these calls, you'll have, you can pass exactly these parameters that are available for that call. They are mostly also all optional, same as with the CLI calls. If you don't specify an argument, then the default is picked up just as you would get on a command line.
We have several questions that have come in the meantime.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
How do you handle the strange characters in file names when you do the call?
Yeah, that's obviously from Jan. Yeah, it needs to be tested. Normally, that should not be a big issue, but I've learned when it comes to special characters to never say that it's an issue without testing it. So that's something we should test, Jan.
Then also, when are files downloaded, even if the job is queued, or only once the processing starts?
Very good question. As far as I remember, and unfortunately, the guy who implemented it, which is not me, was not available today. as far as I remember, things are downloaded as the request comes in, because we want to make sure that the request is valid, and then it is queued. Yeah. So when you make a request, we actually do quite a bit of validity checking on what you've sent. And that is not so much from a security point of view, but to make it easier to implement this. It is always my preference that if you use something and you do it wrong, that you fail very soon, and that you immediately see that it's wrong and that you haven't specified things correctly. That's what we try to do here as well. And if I remember correctly, that means that we check for the availability of any local resources and so on. Of course, we don't have to copy those because they are locally available, but we check for them to make sure that those are okay. And then we download the files and store them to make sure that those are available as well.
Follow up on that is that will downloaded files and generated files by Toolbox be deleted after a job is done?
Yes, there is a configuration setting also that, and again, remember that we're not talking about something that is SaaS or runs in the cloud or that you can't touch or whatever. This is normally something that is installed next to your pdfToolbox CLI, so presumably somewhere that you have access to. There is a configuration setting that lets you determine how long files are retained. And that is mostly because we allow polling. If the only way to get results would be this webhook that we call, and then you know for sure when a file is done. But as we allow polling, yeah, you could do that an hour after the facts, or however, whatever your implementation is. So you can specify how long files are retained.
Okay, and the last one I have right now is unrelated to the files, but Seb says it's very cool and asks how long it took to develop the tool.
I didn't develop it, so for me it didn't take very long. It didn't take very long to do this, also because this is a relatively limited implementation, as I'm sure you understand as well. Yeah, our goal really was to create something that would make our life easier, and we think that this doesn't only make sense for us, but it is something that can be used by other people in projects as well. So it's something that will have a price, but that we make available. There are many things in here that we don't do that probably would take a lot of time in implementing them. Yeah, I could probably say that all the difficult things we decided not to do yet, and that makes it easier. I think the only really difficult thing that we do here is we make sure that the queuing works correctly, and we've chosen a queuing mechanism that I hesitate to say the name of the library because I'm not 100% sure. We've had lots of discussion about it, but we chose a queuing library that is really overkill for what we're doing, that would also support priorities and stuff like that. We're not using that at the moment, but having that means that if we want to allow you to send in a high priority job, for example, that would jump the queue, or if we would give you an API call at some point where you can say this request now needs to move up to the front of the queue, that would be possible with that library. But many of the very difficult other things, like the fact of having this running in a SaaS environment where you can't access the server that easily, where you would need to think about proper licensing in a SaaS environment, security in a SaaS environment, we have not handled that at the moment. Yeah. If you think about not having one pdfToolbox instance behind this but having multiple instances and sharing the load across these, then we have not really done that. There would be a way of still using dispatcher satellites in the background, and then you would be able to build load balancing or load sharing in that way. But that's not typically how you would want to implement that in this kind of system. It would be much nicer if the load balancing was implemented in here and would be able to drive multiple pdfToolbox CLIs. It's also a very hard thing to do, and we have not implemented that. So it didn't take as much time as it would take if we would have tackled all the complex problems. Any other questions?
In chat right now, but people feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions or to type them in chat as well.
Yeah, so this is more or less what I wanted to show. It's like I said in the beginning, it's a very simple shell around pdfToolbox CLI that can still make it a lot easier to get a project done and do the communication with the pdfToolbox that you embed in there. And that was also our intent. And in the projects that we've used it so far, it seems to live up to that purpose as well. As you can see, and I will end with that. As you can see, the only things I have here are admin and basic. Like I said, we have used more advanced API calls, but then in a specific project, we have not implemented them in general yet. This is something that I would be interested in doing, that we are open to doing, but that I would prefer to do also if there is demand for it in a particular context, in a particular project, for example. There are plenty of ideas. There is no shortage of things that you can put in a more advanced part of the REST API, and I'm not even thinking about the complex things that people can do in one process plan. What we have identified as a candidate is that in many projects, people want to do the same thing, but it's not one thing, it's multiple things. You want to run a profile to generate a production file. You probably want to generate some preview images because you want to show them somewhere. You want a report in a format that is easy to deal with. You might want a proof version of the file. So there is a bunch of things. And what we have to tell people now is, oh, you can do that, but that means that either you make a very complex process plan and it generates multiple things, or you will have multiple calls to pdfToolbox. Now you first generate a production file, and then you take that production file and you generate images. I think it would make sense in that advanced part of the API to, now I'm telling you things that we haven't done yet, but I think they're a good idea. So anyway, I think it would make sense to bundle these things and say, here you have a call that is configured to allow you to specify a production profile, a proofing profile, an indication of which thumbnails you want at what resolution, and maybe some other things. Yeah, and then you would have one call. The return would be a zip file with all the information that you requested in a strict format, and then you can deal with that. Or we would run it, we would return to you a JSON with a bunch of URLs for the different things that you've asked for, and you can download the stuff that you want, and so on. So there are definitely ideas for that. I'm not a big proponent of starting that without also having actual practical need for these things. No more questions?
One more question. Will the REST API be included with our current license?
No. That's a very easy answer. No, because this is a, as you saw on the first slide, this is a Four Pees API. It's something that we have developed to work with pdfToolbox CLI. It will be commercially available, but it will have a price. Feel free to ask what the price is. I don't know at the moment. We haven't really determined that 100%, but I will be very happy to have a conversation with any of you who is interested about that offline. But it's very clearly our own development. We're going to support it long term. We will have to, because we're using it in our own projects as well. But it will have a price. Yeah. Okay.
That's it for questions. So I guess
cool.
We can round it off.
Yeah, I think so. Thank you very much for joining. Before I send you all off, once again, next week is the introduction of pdfToolbox 13. There is lots of interesting stuff that we have to talk about, trust me. 5 times 2 sessions. So if you see all of them, 10 hours in total. You can choose whether you see them in the afternoon or more towards the evening. They are repeated every day twice. So you can choose which one is most convenient. If you miss it, then you can still look at the recordings afterwards. And that is also important. Next week, there is no Four Pees Café because we have this week-long introduction. But the week after that, there is a Four Pees Café, and there we will have a summary of the introductions for pdfToolbox 13. So I hesitate to say what the date would be for that one, but so not next week, but the week after that on Thursday at 4 p.m. As usual. We will have a cafe of, I'm sure that one will be an hour and probably a little longer, but there we will give you a summary of all the news for pdfToolbox 13. So if you missed sessions during the week and you just want a recap or a short summary, then join that cafe and we will try to summarize it in 1 hour. No promises though. Thank you very much. Good to see so many of you again. I am sure I will see many of you many times next week for the pdfToolbox 13 introduction. I also think I've said that enough now that is next week. So I'm sure I will see many of you next week. Looking forward to that. I hope you are as well, and have a great rest of the day. Goodbye.